Good morning.
Volovici always has an echo.
Oh. First. I'm trying again. Good morning. Now it's. It works. It works. We'll continue our discussion started yesterday. And in this session, the problem, we'll start with a problem relevant for every discussion about present-day antisemitism, globalization. The problem of confronting antisemitism, present antisemitism, and the manipulation of collective memory, the Holocaust denial, and education for Holocaust. Before dealing with these topics in post-communist countries in this session, and in the next session with the collective memory and the memory of the Holocaust in Germany, we have a chance to have a broader perspective, a philosophical one, and based on a huge experience on the problem of dealing with the heavy luggage of Europe, with the problem of Holocaust and education about Holocaust. And I think nobody is more appropriate and competent for this problem than Professor Yehuda Bauer, which is the founder and the first chair of the Vidal Sassoon International Center for the Study of Antisemitism. And he will approach this problem from a broader perspective, and I think it's the most appropriate start for the debates in these morning sessions. Professor Bauer.
Thank you, Leon. I think the subject that I'm going to talk about, Holocaust education and antisemitism, is really a kind of a marginal comment on the main topic of this conference on multiculturalism and ethnic identity. But I think it's an essential marginal comment. So the problem that I would like to deal with is this. Is education about the Holocaust a useful tool in the struggle against anti-Semitism? And because I'm not sure that the chairman will give me the possibility to read out the whole business here, I want to put the cart very firmly before the horse and tell you my conclusion. The conclusion is, it ain't necessarily so. But there are ways in which this could become more effective, perhaps, than we are managing to do at the moment. After all, the Holocaust was caused, at least in my opinion, largely by anti-Semitism. And if you expose the anti-Semitic background of what most people in most countries that we call the West see as a thoroughly evil regime, you thereby argue against anti-Semitic stereotypes. But the empirical results of Holocaust education are by no means that positive. Latent anti-Semitic attitudes prevalent in many countries may cause people to see in the Holocaust a justified reaction of a European civilization threatened by the Jews. They may not utter these thoughts explicitly, but their reaction to what they are taught may actually be that, well, Nazism was very bad, but we can understand why they acted against the Jews. Perhaps they exaggerated and should not have gone to the extremes that they did, but basically it was the Jews' fault for being such a nuisance. In today's Europe, Israel is seen as the embodiment of the Jewish spirit, and actions against the Palestinians arouse a violent reaction in which the Israeli Jews become Nazis and the Palestinians become Jews. When we then teach the Holocaust, this reversal of roles may act to fortify anti-Semitism rather than weaken it. Also, for second-generation Muslim immigrant youth in Western, Central, Northern and Southern, not yet Eastern Europe, and there are some 23 million Muslims in Europe today, the lack of integration into European society which they experience makes a minority among them identify that society, European society, in their eyes an oppressive society with Nazism. And the Jews are seen as a conspiracy that has a disproportionate and evil influence on the society that appears to reject them. They, the Muslim youths, then become the persecuted, parallel to the Jews during the Holocaust, and the Jews become the representatives of the oppressive regime. The Jews in European countries represent the quasi-Nazi Israeli oppressors of Palestinian Muslims, and the Holocaust, in the eyes of some Muslim youths, becomes a Jewish justification for this oppression. In addition, and in a way contradictory to what I have just said, the Muslim environment is oftentimes the place where the Holocaust is denied, either completely or in part, and it becomes extremely difficult to teach it or even mention it. But it is not just second-generation Muslim immigrant youth. In fact, a Swedish study recently has shown that in Sweden, at any rate, Muslim youth are not averse to studying the Holocaust, but a certain proportion of Swedish youths object to it. They don't want to deal with what appears to them to be irrelevant to their lives. In Germany, a similar study has shown that German youths object to being constantly fed programs dealing with the Holocaust. They've had enough of it and close themselves against further efforts, not necessarily because of a dislike of Jews, but because the topic is oppressive and they dislike having it repeated to them, as they say, all the time. If these are some of the difficulties one faces with Holocaust education, further analysis is called for. Let me start by reviewing the spread of Holocaust education in the last few decades. In the Netherlands, the destruction of Dutch Jews was taught immediately after the war, but not as a specifically Jewish tragedy, but rather as part of the suffering of the Dutch people at German hands. Elsewhere, the Holocaust was hardly mentioned. Even before 1948, and certainly after that, the Holocaust became part of what Jewish children learned about in Palestine and later in Israel. But there was no organized curriculum in Israel on the Holocaust until the early 80s. Teaching about the Shoah was left to the initiative of school directors and teachers, sometimes even of high school pupils. I remember very well that Professor Mordechai Altshuler, many of you know him, and I went to Yosef ben Shlomo, the nationalist philosopher and writer, who then was the pedagogic director of our Ministry of Education, and we suggested to him that the Institute of Contemporary Jewry should write a textbook for high schools on the subject. Ben Shlomo thought this was superfluous. People knew what had happened. This was during the late 70s. Israel Gutman and Chaim Schatzker published a Hebrew textbook on the Holocaust sponsored by Yad Vashem in 1983, fully 22 years after the Eichmann trial. By that time, textbooks had appeared in Germany and the United States, and Holocaust education had gradually become part of curricula and textbooks in a number of countries. The way the Holocaust was dealt with in Israel was often completely distorted, or else all kinds of myths found their expressions in teaching. In the Soviet Union and its satellites, there was, of course, no hope at all for any kind of education about the subject. In the United States, there grew a slow realization that the Holocaust had been a pivotal event in human history. It started with academia. In 1975, a first international conference on the Holocaust was held at the Carnegie Institute in New York with Abba Kovner, Raoul Hilberg, Isaiah Trung, Nathan Rothenstreich, Saul Friedlander, and many others in attendance. This percolated down in Jewish schools in the United States, but increasingly also private Catholic schools and some Protestant ones began teaching the subject. I published my textbook for colleges in 1982 with the title A History of the Holocaust, and it was and is being used partly in high schools as well. The founding of the Washington Holocaust Museum was another milestone, though the museum was open only in 1993, and educational efforts spread out from there. At the same period, Margot Strom founded the Facing History and Ourselves organization based in Boston, which spread Holocaust education mainly in the eastern part of the United States and is very active to this day. In Germany, teaching about the Holocaust started with Christian circles, mainly in Rhineland-Westphalen. But the 1968 revolts made it almost obligatory for the left throughout Germany. What was taught both in Germany and the United States was mainly the side of the perpetrators. Why and how did the German Nazis perpetrate the Holocaust, the genocide? What was the decision-making process? How did the victims suffer in the concentration camps? The victims themselves were presented purely as suffering objects. Their culture and attempts to protect themselves were largely ignored. Raoul Hilberg's monumental study, The Destruction of the European Jews, published already in 1961, increasingly influenced education, of course mostly indirectly, as few teachers and educators managed to read that huge volume. Jewish councils, the Judenräte, were largely seen as bunches of traitors, and that was fortified by the adoration for the great exception to the rule, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Academic research created a background to a spread of knowledge. In its wake came a growing impact of films and TV productions, both documentary and fictional, seen by many millions of people. The most important cinematic event was the three-part series Holocaust, produced in 1978, in the same year that the Washington Memorial Museum was founded. Holocaust was viewed by over 110 million Americans, and later by 19 million Germans. A typical case of Hollywood kitsch, it had a tremendous impact and prepared American society for a speedy and trendy expansion of Holocaust research and education. Holocaust was followed by other ventures of this type, and some more serious efforts as well, to face up to the moral and social problems that the Holocaust presented. In 1985, Lanzmann's Shoah, all 9.5 hours of it, hit the screens and became, among other things, a source for clips used in classrooms in the West. What followed was a veritable explosion of theatrical, cinematic, television, musical, artistic, and other attempts to deal with the topic. Since then, attempts to teach the Holocaust in schools grew, mainly in the US, the Netherlands, largely because of the presence there of the Anne Frank House, and Germany. That is also where most of the academic research was concentrated. The whole scene was unorganized, and the emphasis, as before, was on the perpetrators. Moral conclusions were sought. A turning point came with the organization of the huge Oxford Conference, with its 600 participants, paid for by Robert Maxwell, the controversial British Jewish press baron, whose mysterious death a few years later is still not solved. The conference was chaired by his wife, Dr. Elizabeth Maxwell, a French Protestant, who saw it mainly as an attempt to bridge gaps between the Jewish and the Christian perceptions of the Holocaust. The publication of the papers presented there, I think, influenced teaching in the Western world. A tremendous push forward was the unexpected commitment of the Swedish Prime Minister, Göran Persson, to enter the field of Holocaust education. It was the result, paradoxically, of a misinterpretation of a poll of Swedish high school students that caused his intervention. The post supposedly showed a fatal weakening of the youth's commitment to democracy and an alarming rise in Holocaust denial, accompanied by the rise of the influence of neo-Nazi propaganda. The Swedish reaction was to send a governmental delegation to Israel to study educational strategies and to commission two young Jewish scholars, Paul Levine and Stefan Bruchfeld, to write an 80-page summary of the history of the Holocaust, which they called Tell Ye Your Children, V'higadeta Levanecha. The book was not sold, but sent to the homes of Swedes who asked for it, and some 800,000 copies was thus sent. A special government-financed organization was set up, called Levande Historia, Living History, which exists to this day and is engaged on teaching Holocaust and genocide studies, and also deals with racism and discrimination of all kinds in Swedish society. Contacts were established with roughly similar efforts, especially in Germany. In 1998, Persson decided to set up an international organization to propagate Holocaust education, primarily in high schools, and sent personal letters to Clinton and Blair to ask for their support. After receiving positive answers, he set up the International Task Force for Cooperation on Holocaust Education, Remembrance and Research, long title, ITF, and asked me to become its academic advisor. On my suggestion, Israel, Germany, and Poland were invited to join, and immediately afterwards France and Netherlands joined as well. This led to the organization in 2000 of a big international conference on Holocaust education that met in Stockholm, with some 38 governmental delegations in attendance. The outcome was a commitment of all the countries, on paper at least, to educate about the Holocaust, and that was summarized in what is now known as the Stockholm Declaration. The declaration was seen by its author and authors as something that would probably adorn the insides of waste paper baskets of ministries all over Europe and the Americas. Somewhat surprisingly, it has become a major international document and the Magna Carta of the ITF. The ITF itself, which was originally thought of as a temporary body that would encourage Holocaust education in a number of countries and then disappear, has become a thriving and growing international organization whose main job is to provide a diplomatic umbrella for Holocaust education. It now comprises 24 governments, represented either by ambassadors or by high officials in ministries of education and foreign affairs or both. Its various subcommittees organize teachers' seminars, subsidize educational publications, provide seed money for films, subsidize exhibitions and books, and encourage conferences of young academics. The money for all this comes again in contradiction to expectations from the participating governments, each of whom pays $25,000, soon now to become 25,000 euros, into a common kitty. The chairmanship rotates yearly. Currently, the chair country is Hungary. Each chair country, in its turn, invests rather large sums of money, something like 400 to 500,000 euros, in its efforts to maintain and develop the programs. Plenary meetings take place twice a year, but the committees, mainly the educational working group, where each country is represented by 2 teachers or other professionals, meet several times yearly. The main effort up till now has been invested in Central and East Central Europe, with tentacles extending to the Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and even China. In November 2005, as you probably all know, the United Nations decided in a rare unanimous vote, because avid supporters of Jewish causes such as Iran and most of the other Muslim countries absented themselves, to designate January 27, the date on which in 1945 Auschwitz was liberated by the Red Army, as International Holocaust Memorial Day. More importantly, perhaps, the resolution also talked about spreading the word educationally throughout the world. the world. The whole thing was handed to the UN Undersecretary for Communication and Information, a wonderful youngish, headed by a wonderful youngish Indian by the name of Shashi Tharoor and his largely Indian group, all of them tremendously intelligent and very active. They are thinking about accepting the proposal that they should be active mainly in Asia and Africa, as there are beginnings of Holocaust education in Japan and China, and interest has been shown by countries like Ghana, Nigeria, and of course, and very actively, by Rwanda for obvious reasons. A great deal is already being done in Australia, less so in New Zealand, and there are some serious beginnings in Latin American countries like Argentina, which is an ITF member, Mexico and Uruguay. You may well ask, if the situation is so good, why is it so bad? Let me answer this question in a roundabout way, which is typical for a Jewish pseudo-intellectual like myself. In most of what is very inaccurately known as the Western world, the Holocaust is seen as the embodiment of evil, as the extreme form of a general malady, sometimes as a unique form of the malady, for a number of reasons. The main ones, I think, are the fact that it took place at the main, if not the main center, of what was seen as the most progressive and liberal civilization the world had produced. And that its victims were peculiar people who had produced some of the most important and influential elements from which the culture of the Euro-American civilization had developed. This realization is not usually verbalized or even consciously thought of. It is a kind of emerging consensus that began to develop a generation after 1945 and then increased snowball-like and increases as time goes on. There are additional elements in this, I think. There's a growing realization that there were unprecedented elements in the Holocaust, such as the intended totality of the genocide. The Nazis and their allies wanted to kill every single person they defined as being Jewish, ultimately everywhere in the world. So for the first time in human history, a genocide was to have a universal character. Its ideology, too, was unprecedented because it stemmed from a mutation of Christian antisemitism and was based on hallucinations, such as the purported Jewish world conspiracy, the blood libel, the argument that the Jews were a satanic and therefore corrupting presence in history. Christianity had never planned a genocide of the Jews, but Nazi anti-Semitism got rid of Christian morality and was left with pure anti-Semitism, so to speak. The Holocaust also created a terrible problem for the Christian world. 1900 years after the appearance of the Christian Messiah, who had preached the gospel of love, his people had been murdered by baptized Gentiles. This is a realization that is progressively penetrating Christian thinking and has had some well-known practical results in the development of the Catholic Church since John the 23rd and since the declaration of the Holocaust by the German Lutheran Church in 1980. All this, I think, had a cumulative effect in turning the Holocaust into a universal issue, marking it as the expression of near ultimate evil and making it the paradigm of genocide. If you wanted to educate against genocide and mass murder, and by extension against prejudice, racism and discrimination of the proverbial other, it was a good idea to take the Holocaust, the most extreme genocide so far, as your case study, which would lead to consideration of the dark side of human existence. The problem, however, is that with the expansion of Holocaust education came the inevitable struggle about content. What exactly do we teach when we teach about the genocide of the Jews? Here the influence of Yad Vashem has become very important. The Yad Vashem International School has over the past about 10 years developed pedagogical and didactic strategies that are influencing many teachers in many countries. In the past year, for instance, groups of teachers, about 20 to 30 in each course, have come to Jerusalem from 18 countries for 2 weeks each. By now, many hundreds of teachers have absorbed these strategies. The way the Holocaust is taught, largely all over the ITF countries, is, I think, moving away from the concept of the uniqueness of the Holocaust. Instead, the concept of unprecedentedness is increasingly used, which means that nothing like this has happened before, but it was done by humans, for human reasons, and could serve as a precedent if we don't act against its reoccurrence, which may happen in a similar or roughly similar manner. In fact, one may argue that that is what is happening today. That is not only true, but also provides an incentive to learn about it, because it means that there is at least a chance in a million that events such as the Holocaust might be limited or even prevented. This opens up the possibility of dealing with the Holocaust on two levels. One, as an unprecedented and specifically Jewish event because of the victims, their position in the Christian-Muslim world, and the reasons why they became the victims of a global genocidal ideology. And two, as an example of genocides that have been happening since 1945 and are happening now in front of our eyes in Darfur, for instance. Teaching the Holocaust becomes a topical subject. There's a growing consensus among historians of the Holocaust that the basic motivation for the murder was not some functionalism, but anti-Semitic ideology, though a host of other factors, economic, social, and political, also played an important role. There's an attempt to argue against those who say that they are fed up with hearing about anti-Semitism and the Jews, that World War II, with its dozens of millions of victims, was caused by a Nazi ideology in which anti-Semitism played a central role. Or in other words, that anti-Semitism was a main cause in the death of many millions of non-Jews. The warning that this presents of us is emphasized. There is no doubt that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has a direct bearing on Holocaust education. Often, it is not seen as a tragic conflict between two ethnicities or between two extremist religious ideologies, but as a one-sided struggle in which the Palestinians are fighting for independence and dignity as against an Israeli oppression. Israel is the collective Jew, and all Jews everywhere are identified with whatever policies any current Israeli government pursues. In such a situation, anti-Semitism becomes a minor issue, irrelevant to the Mideast conflict and its international ramifications. For young people, the real background is fuzzy and too complicated. They see pictures of humiliated and heavily disadvantaged Palestinians. And yes, sometimes also Palestinian terror attacks on the Israelis. And want to see a situation in which this kind of thing doesn't happen. Anti-Semitism and the memory of the Holocaust become irrelevant. And local, international, and global issues take pride of place. If there was even a temporary or partial easing of the conflict, we might see an easing of Western anti-Semitism and an easier educational situation. But this would do little to diminish significantly the prevalence of latent anti-Semitism. But this is unlikely to happen. We are actually helped by our dear friend Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who tends to make anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel, again, very topical and an unacceptable option for these Western youngsters. In this seesaw of influences and attitudes, what exactly do we try to teach? I should make it clear that I am talking of non-Jewish teachers teaching non-Jewish youngsters in society that have other worries and problems, with Jewish institutions and individuals, from Yad Vashem to the Washington Museum, as important elements, but not of decisive influence necessarily. The basic point of view is the view of the Holocaust as the paradigmatic genocide, thus making it a starting point for topical discussions aimed at assessing the risks of genocide to human society generally. The next point, then, is to deal with the Jews as subjects, not just as objects or victims of a genocidal movement and state. The emphasis is on describing Jewish life and culture, showing the Jewish people as a contributor to human civilization, and presenting the Nazi regime and similar anti-Semitic and racist systems as a danger to all civilized peoples. This is done with an emphasis on individual, family, and community stories. In the Czech Republic, just for an example, as an example, teachers ask pupils to investigate in their areas where the Jews lived, who they were, what their culture was, and exactly what happened to them. This then was copied in other countries. In Poland, a recently published textbook for high schools deals with Jewish history in Poland, makes the pupils acquainted with Jewish traditions and customs, comparing them to Polish Catholic ones, confronts Polish anti-Semitism in the interwar period, and only then deals with what happened to the Jews during the Holocaust, including the problematic attitude of the Polish population to them. These positive efforts also include clear statements about current issues, as these in any case come up with upper grades of high schools and must be dealt with. The difference between legitimate political criticism of any current Israeli government on one hand, such as exercised by myself, for instance, and very sharply so, and the attack on Israel as the collective Jew, reflecting anti-Semitic traditions, is on the one hand. That is on the one hand. And the attack on Israel as the collective Jew, reflecting anti-Semitic traditions, on the other hand. An example for that is the forthcoming exhibition on anti-Semitism for young people in Germany, co-sponsored by the Zentrum für Antisemitismusforschung in Berlin, the most serious European effort in this area, which consists of non-Jewish personnel only, and Yad Vashem. Another major point is, of course, the danger of radical Islamic anti-Semitism, which for the first time since 1945 explicitly threatens Jews all over the world, including, of course, Israel, with mass murder. Clearly, not all these efforts are successful, and in some countries we encounter hidden or sometimes open opposition. In Denmark, for instance, the Holocaust Memorial Day there, this year, did not even mention the Holocaust in its title, and dealt with Auschwitz without mentioning the Jews were the main victims there. Academic, anti-Semitic, and anti-Israeli propaganda is ever present. I must say that most European governments are on our side, as is the Council of Europe and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, an umbrella organization of 55 governments with its center in Europe. As you all know, our problem are the chattering classes, the media, academia, the intellectuals, people like ourselves. Not a majority, certainly, not everywhere, but dangerous enough, nevertheless. There's a problem of a multicultural approach. On the one hand, without recognizing the legitimacy of different cultural, ethnic, or religious groups, no legitimization of a Jewish presence is possible. But on the other hand, an accepting of radical Islamic groups in a Europe that contains 23 million Muslims under a multicultural slogan may mean that when the Jews insist on their specificity as well as on their participation in general culture, they may be discriminated against as a group and as individuals. And Israel may be seen as the enemy of the civilization they seek to develop. However, we should be very much interested in the positive integration of these Muslim multitudes in a multicultural Europe, because it is only non-radical Muslims who can struggle against the Muslim radicals in their midst. But only if, as a result of that real integration into a liberal European society, is achieved as Muslims accept the European civilization into which they would wish to integrate. Otherwise, multiculturalism would mean the opposite of what it ideally wants to achieve. One can conclude by saying quite clearly, Holocaust education in itself is not a defense against anti-Semitism. But if one engages in it judiciously and with sufficient depth, it can help. Those of us working in that vineyard have an easier time in the ex-communist countries outside of the former Soviet Union than in Western Europe. It is a constant struggle in which we have to adapt ourselves to changing situations, steer clear of propagandistic slogans, and impress our listeners that we have something to tell them that affects their own lives, their own futures. Holocaust is not past. Holocaust is present. Education is a long-term investment, and we should not expect immediate and sensational results. To use a completely inappropriate phrase, Rome was not built in a day. But then, neither was Jerusalem, I think.
Thank you, Professor Yehuda Bauer. We now turn back to the post-communist countries with two well-known experts on the field. The first one will be Dr. Raphael Vago from the Tel Aviv University. His talk will be, exact title, not the title in the program, The Anti-Globalism and Jews in the Era of Multiculture, the New Frontier of Post-Communist Antisemitism. Professor Vago is a senior researcher at the Institute of Stefan Roth Institute for the Study of Antisemitism from the Tel Aviv University. He's a senior lecturer at the same university, Department of History, and at the Center for Russian and East European Studies. He was well known, very involved in the study of post-communist and communist countries on the Balkans, in Romania, Yugoslavia, and with many studies and papers on antisemitism, on globalization, and the present effects of multiculturalism. Please.
Yes, of course. Thank you very much, Leon. You are quite formal when you mentioned in my title the word multiculturalism. I used in my title the word multiculti, but it sounds the same. The dramatic changes in the former communist countries since 1989 have shaped the new old forms of anti-Semitism in the region, drawing from traditional themes as well as the adaptation of old perceptions to the new realities. In the past years, for our purposes, two new, but in fact old arguments have been added to the anti-Semitic discourse and its political manifestations. One, the Jewish role as agents and beneficiaries of globalization, and second, the Jewish interest and role in multiculturalism. Both trends are presented as destructive to the national interest and values. Both motives are deeply linked to the identity politics and the wide-ranging debates and discourse on national identity in an era of globalization and multiculturalism. Both trends, with their impacts on the intellectual, political, social, and national life of post-communist societies, have an important role and place in the shaping of the post-communist regime's direction for the future, their economy, and society. The interests of the post-communist states to integrate into the various Western agencies and frameworks of integration have brought these societies in closer contacts with the various processes of globalization, not only in terms of economic influences, but also in terms of a spiritual challenge to the nation, national independence, and the very survival of the national spirit in an age of global trends and gradual abolition of national frontiers. National identity, which seemed to be regained with the downfall of communism and rebuilt by various forces in society, found itself again in danger due to the new trends in which post-communist societies found themselves. Multiculturalism in its various forms, very much at the core of debates and argued about in post-communist societies, is one of the major features of post-communist society with wide-ranging impacts on the newly emerging societies. The debates focusing on both trends, globalization and multiculturalism, are running along parallel lines, and from a nationalist point of view, both trends present a destructive challenge to the community and to the very survival of the ethnic community, its economy, culture, and spirit. The opposition to globalization in the post-communist countries brought elements of the old left together in a common platform with the new old right. Both emphasize the impact of the global trends on the local poor, unable to compete with the multinational companies and the shopping malls they build, or as Churka in Hungary calls them, the plaza culture of the invading Jewish and Israeli interests. Both the left and the right, in their own specific language and tone, but very often in growingly similar ones, using a populist terminology, criticize the impact of globalization on the national economies and cultures. The transition from communism to something that seemed unclear in the 90s, as perhaps is also seen today, became to some segments of society a transition from communism to a yet again kidnapped future, this time by heartless, wild capitalism acting on a global scale, destroying the soul of the nation that was not yet regained after the fall of communism. The right wing will emphasize the so-called economic and cultural genocide, the danger to the national spirit in a time of globalization, while the left will emphasize the economic impact of globalization and the destruction of national economy by selling out to foreign interests and the victory of the US mentality of Wall Street and its global interests. The Jews, if we look at the protocols of the elders of Zion, were the first promoters of globalization. And what are the protocols, if not the blueprint for a worldwide Jewish domination based on global trends that invaded the various societies then and now? Thus, anti-Semitic anti-globalism is a repetition with updated data of the old stereotype of a worldwide Jewish network of interests and conspiracy. Times of dramatic changes are hard to explain, and the age-old formula of Jewish conspiracy and Jewish interests catches on easily. Perhaps our problem in explaining this phenomena is that while some of researchers tried to understand the appearance of this type of anti-Semitic arguments in the early 90s, in the first years of the hardships of transition, we are still faced, and even more, with such a trend 15 or 16 years later. Stalin and Zhdanov's cosmopolitans were Jews promoting a rootless culture and were replaced by those who promote today the decline of national cultures due to the grants handed out by the Soros Fellowship programs. One may see in the campaigns against Soros programs for an open society a campaign against the so-called destructive anti-national element of those programs, starting from supporting the Central European University in Budapest to seminars in Chisinau, Moldova, and other places. In a typical analysis of global processes, for example, the Hungarian Demokrata Weekly published a review of Soros' book in which the reviewer wrote that the Foundation for an Open Society is a huge project led by a hyper-aggressive, exclusivist, left-liberal, Jewish hardcore. Never mind that Soros, in an interview given to the New York Times this Sunday, on the 11th of June 2006, was very critical of Israel and referred to his comparison between the Nazis and the Bush regime. Jewish global interests were seen behind the US attack on Serbia in April 1999, a theme voiced by Serb as well as by the East European anti-Semitic right. In Hungary, for example, Churka's analysis in lengthy articles was that the US-led war in the Balkans was motivated by Jewish interests so the Jewish capital could flow freely. Although the logic behind such analysis was not always clear, it anyhow served the purpose of presenting US actions as being done for Israeli interests. In a twist to the US Jewish-Israeli interests against Serbia, a new version was put forward by Hungarian Muslim site, conveniently called www.Islam, which wrote, for whoever reads it, the Jews and Serb fascists are now working together against Croats and especially the Bosnian Muslims, along with the United States, in a campaign against peaceful Islam. At the time, during the US attack on Serbia, the Greater Romania Party in Romania was more straightforward. It published a drawing equating the swastika with the Star of David and the names of the top US officials at that time of Jewish origin, Albright, Cohen, and Berger. Since the war in Iraq, the left and the right have found a common language in placing Israeli, Jewish, global, and regional interests at the forefront of US policy in Iraq. Criticism against Israel and Israeli interests appear, for example, in all the sites and the newspapers of the old communist parties in their various forms active today around the region. The anti-globalist extreme left-wing Italian-based site Campo Anti-Imperialista, which has editions in several languages, including East European ones, places Israeli world interests and brutal Israeli policies in the context of globalization and US-Israeli financial interests. As mentioned already at our conference, Israel is seen today as the country of apartheid. It is the racist imperialist state guilty of the murder of Palestinians, just as the US pursues its policy of murder in Iraq. To this we have to add, of course, the conspiracy theories around the Jewish-Israeli role in 9/11, aimed at shifting attention from the Israeli oppression against Palestinians to an anti-Muslim attitude in the West. The reformers, those trying to upgrade economies to the needs of joining the European Union, and those in Russia trying to change the functioning of the system and discard old mentalities, are, of course, the Jews. Or, in the words of General Makashov of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation in 1998, following that time of the collapse of the rubble, he said, deceit, corruption, and thievery are flourishing in this country. That's why I call the reformers Yid. In similar tones, the leader of the Communist Party, Gennady Zyuganov, treated Zionism, but there is no need to analyze his texts. After all, there were almost word-by-word repetitions of the Brezhnev era propaganda. The Jews, and of course the Israelis, are presented as symbolizing with the main other force of the axis of evil, the United States, dangers of liberalism and Western-style democracy, and the dangers to the national patriotic sentiments. Thus, on the eve of 15th of March, celebrating in Hungary the beginning of the 1848 revolution, a right-wing website wrote, "With your arguments, take aim and attack the sacred cause of liberalism. Attack the dictator of the world, the United States, the Israeli who is humiliating the independence-seeking Palestinian. Attack the Imre Kertész who besmirches Hungary, and attack the European Union, lend Hungary for our land. And then, if you do that, together with us, you will feel not the cozy, soft-thinking, sitting couches of the commercial world, but the real meaning of March 15th. Thus, the United States, Israel, the Jewish Nobel Prize laureate, and the land Hungary, European Union, and modern commerce are branded together as those elements which deprive from the Hungarians to feel a genuine March 15th holiday. Likewise, the present Polish coalition includes, among others, the movement of Andriy Leper, who has a populist nationalist platform as the party warns against foreign financial interests taking over the national economy and spirit, all those with an overt anti-Semitic rhetoric. Such populist, if not right-wing nationalist groups will seek out, and this is not so difficult, the names of Jewish and Israeli business interests who serve at once both Jewish and global interests, which are actually one and the same. Not to speak of Radio Maria, which is an embarrassment to the Vatican. Poland's bigoted government, and this is not my expression but the title of an editorial in this Sunday's New York Times, is using xenophobia, homophobia, and perhaps Judeophobia in large doses, which we should pay more attention to, because Poland's case may become a case study in the tension between segments of society and the pains of joining the European Union. However, it would be difficult, even for a well-seasoned anti-Semite, to identify Jewish rule over the European Union. Thus, the identification of the EU with Jewish interest has not, at least yet, raised its head. But the warnings against the results of joining the EU in those countries that already joined, and the fears of those willing but not yet part of the EU, are being constructed in such a way that they may be seen as part of an overall danger of being dominated by Jewish finance and Jewish interests. When warning of foreign interests and multinational corporations, the very name of multinational already smells of a Jewish Geschäft. The support of Jewish organizations to the joining of some states to the EU, as the support given to Romania, is already an indication to the anti-Semites that if Jews are interested and promoting the joining of a state to the EU, this is in itself a proof that there is a Jewish interest behind the European Union. Those following the websites, and they are growing and becoming more multilingual, of the anti-globalization groups, will find a growing network of contacts and ties with a variety of groups linking each other in informal coalitions, including elements that can be classified as a brown-red coalition. Thus, the Polish branch of the anti-globalization movement, ATTAC, enjoys, if this is a correct expression, the support of right-wing extremists as Jarosław Tomasiewicz, while an organ linked to the movement publishes articles by the Russian National Bolshevik leader Alexander Dugin, and among others, praised Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. Their messages, not always following a clear, logical way of thinking between left and right, are anti-American, against the United States, but actually against Zionist hegemony, anti-globalist, anti-liberal, and of course, against multiculturalism. As I have just mentioned Dugin, I would like to note that he represents a special case of so-called radical centrism, an expression published in the Moscow Times of the 1st of June this year, in which bizarre apocalyptic visions of Russian rebirths appear on an anti-Western platform. Likewise in Slovakia, where it seemed to some observers, and perhaps this remark actually is self-criticism, that it seemed to us that the main anti-Semitic discourse is more on the context of the unfinished past about Tissol's rehabilitation. Lately, also there is a strong anti-globalist, leftist, as well as nationalist campaign in which the Jewish, Israeli financial and global political aims take a major part. This view shared to me, among others, by Professor Pavel Meszcian, the director of the Museum of Jewish Culture in Bratislava and prominent researcher, indicates that the pains of joining the EU have updated the extremist agenda from both sides. Post-communist national identity is challenged and endangered from the two main enemies, globalization and multiculturalism, as I have mentioned. There is no need at this moment to go into theoretical definitions of multiculturalism. Actually, there is a need, but not enough time. So for the sake of this discussion, very briefly, I would like to refer to those aspects of multiculturalism that are almost self-evident in this audience, even though after Professor Bistrick's keynote speech on Monday, we have to rethink some of our notions about the nature of multiculturalism. There were numerous conferences and workshops in the post-communist countries on the topic. There are university courses, and the topic is much evident in the cultural media, although not much used outside academia and the cultural elite. Unlike as in the West, with the large number of immigrants and the role of Islam in the particular countries, in the former communist countries, the debate focuses more on the implications of multiculturalism on the future of ethnic identity in an era of liberal multiculti. The East European right perceives multiculturalism as yet another tool and device made up to blur ethnic and national distinctions and to deconstruct the local national element. By the way, a feature already mentioned by the Vidal Sassoon Center's conference in 1991 on post-communist anti-Semitism. Unlike as in the West, very often the understanding in this criticism of multiculturalism is that it not only elevates other cultures to the same level, but in fact shrewdly enables the Jew to become one who is more equal than the other, thus to dominate the scene by deconstructing the local national identity. By bringing so-called respect to the other, the Jew intends to weaken the majoritarian culture. This motive, of course, recalls the nationalist critique of the Jews in the 19th century, when the Jew was perceived promoting universal values in order to infuse foreign elements into the nation's authentic local values. Jews appear as if, and in Hebrew sounds even better, ke'ilu, to care for other groups, but in fact they do it for their own reasons. By bringing down the majoritarian's hegemony, the eternal Jew strives to build his own one. If we take briefly the anti-Roma gypsy sentiments as a case study, we may find an interesting aspect linked to the Jews. In Hungary, the Israeli academic Katalin Katz not only wrote a PhD on the fate of the Roma in the Holocaust, and your paper published a large interview with her, but through her contacts with a Roma community during her research, she supported, even with a private donation, an appeal of the Roma to the European Court of Human Rights. The extreme right, especially Churka's movement and the weekly Magyar Demokrata, conducted a whole campaign against the Jewish Israeli support of the Roma in order to destabilize Hungary and the Hungarian nation. Needless to say that Katalin Katz was elevated to the rank of a Mossad operative, thus an Israeli intelligence operation in pushing the Roma case on human rights in order to destabilize Hungary. Thus the Jews are the promoters of liberal values opposed to the national interests by using the convenient vehicle of the multicultural values. I could not find a good quotation that would illustrate my point of Jewish cultural domination under the guise of multicultural values, but I did find a Jewish source, and I hope I'm not providing ammunition to the anti-Semites. It is a promo for a klezmer collection of music, and the promo says, among the others, that the band Les Yeux Noirs, World Village, is an example of Yiddish as imagined theme or mood. French Jewish violinists Eric and Oliver Arsbiak lead a group of Romanian non-Jewish musicians. The band links Yiddish, Gypsy, and Romanian style. This is Yiddish as a universalized abstraction, a European Jewish space that is often filled by non-Jewish neo-klezmers and played for a European non-Jewish audience. For God's sake, I don't know what is a neo-klezmer, but I understood in this postmodern language that the Jewish music is a universalized abstraction, a European Jewish space that's filled by non-Jewish neo-klezmers. Summing up as our time is short, I did not intend to present a country-by-country review which would have called for a systematic and comparative presentation of each country's own special agenda in regarding the issues that we are discussing here. My major aim was to present the elements of a red-brown alliance in using anti-Semitic motives in their anti-globalist, anti-liberal, anti-American discourse, and in their specific ways to tackle the problems of multiculturalism in the area. Thank you.
We'll continue now. Thank you, Dr. Vago. We'll continue now with a case study, the Hungary and Hungarian anti-Semitism, and we have the chance to have, I think, the best specialist on analyzing present-day anti-Semitism in Hungary from a sociological point of view. Professor Andras Kovacs is the head of Jewish Studies program at the Central University, European University in Budapest. He's professor there at the Central University, and the director of the Nationalism Studies program. He is also for many years affiliated to our center. He published books and papers in English, German, Hungarian on the anti-Semitic stereotypes in Hungary, with very sophisticated and comprehensive sociological analysis. And I think will complete our perspective by analyzing the stereotypes and the widespread of stereotypes in Hungary today on the Jews and also in topics connected to our conference. Professor.
Thank you, Leon. As we have heard, I represent here the hardcore. As Yehuda Bauer has said before, anti-Semitism has something to do with Jews. So therefore, examining the dynamics of anti-Semitism in Hungary is not a simple academic exercise. Hungary is the country in Central Europe which has a substantial Jewish population. No one knows how many Jews are living in present-day Hungary, but it is for sure that the number of them is higher than 100,000. Survey data from Hungary indicate that a large part of Hungarian society, Jewish and non-Jewish, believes that anti-Semitism has increased in Hungary since the fall of communism. And indeed what can be heard on the streets from time to time or read in certain newspapers, as Raphael quoted them, can and does give rise to anxiety. But are these fears legitimate? Has anti-Semitism already reached an alarming level in Hungary? We know that perception of reality and reality in form of objectified data don't necessarily correspond to each other. Therefore, I would like to address three questions in this short talk. The first one is, has anti-Semitism really grown in Hungary after the collapse of communism? The second one is the question, what actually is the function of anti-Semitism in present-day Hungary? And the third question is there a danger that anti-Semitism will be transformed into an effective political ideology? Let's look at the first question, and now I try to revitalize this computer. It was working. Yeah. It takes a few seconds, no? Because I would like to show you some data, and sociological talks are always full with numbers. I would like to avoid this boring exercise. Okay. The first slide, can you see it? The first slide indicates the result of a survey done by myself in Hungary in 1995, and it shows that the data of extreme anti-Semites at that time in the country was around 10%, and the total number of anti-Semites about 25%. The further surveys done in the same decade indicate. So this is a survey done in '94. Then this is the '95 survey, and this is the 2002 survey. So this data indicate that the percentage of the population that is prejudiced against the Jews is hardly changed during the period under inquiry. More or less 10% of the total adult population was radically anti-Semitic, and another 15% anti-Semitic in a milder way. Thus, based on various indicators, the anxiety felt after the collapse of communism, considering a rapid increase of anti-Semitism, appears to have been exaggerated. But why did the fear occur? Obviously, such anxiety was evidently nurtured by the immediate and unanticipated advance of anti-Semitism after the collapse of communism. Until then, many people believed, not without reason, that anti-Semitic language had been eradicated from the Hungarian public discourse by the enforced silence of decades of communist rule and the almost complete taboo surrounding Jewish topics, legal sanctions against anti-Semitism, and the ban on anti-Semitic utterances. There is no time to discuss here why these beliefs were based on illusions. It should be enough to mention that memoirs, documents, literary pieces, works in oral history, etc., have sufficiently demonstrated that Jewish anti-Jewish sentiments in varying contempt and in varying emotional intensity remained present in the private historical memory in post-war Hungary. Another factor which is important to mention here, that the newly conducted archival research in the communist countries proved that communist politics constantly recreated the Jewish question and associated issues by trying to manipulate the existence or the presence of Jews in the given societies in certain historical periods. It did so even while in Hungary, even while it refused, at least in Hungary, to tolerate overt anti-Semitism, and because of the two factors, the existence of anti-Semitic stereotypes and prejudices in private memory, and as a consequence of communist politics in the communist decades, after 1990, these anti-Semitic attitudes, which could be expressed without hindrance publicly, became very much visible. And this was the reason why the fear and the anxiety appeared. Thus, while our data have not substantiated that in the early 90s, the re-emergence of anti-Semitic prejudice was so abrupt, we still need to ask how to evaluate and interpret the data collected during our investigation. How intensive is the hostility towards Jews in Hungary compared with other European countries? Is the number of anti-Semites in the country greater or smaller than the average in the other European states? In recent years, many different surveys have been conducted on anti-Semitic prejudice in Europe. Here I put together the data stemming from the Anti-Defamation League researches, which were carried out in 2002, 2003, 2004. The table shows for various countries the percentage of respondents agreeing with statements used to measure anti-Semitic prejudice. If we aggregate the responses, then we find that 25% of the total adult population of the 10 countries surveyed proved to be anti-Semitic. Naturally, caution should be applied in comparing the results of surveys conducted with different questions, but we can say that these findings are not very different from the data obtained in Hungary. I have a lot of data here, but I don't want to bore you with them. These figures show that in Hungary and the other countries under investigation, that is, in the old member states of the European Union, excluding the Netherlands, as well as some of the new members, approximately 1/4 of the adult population exhibits anti-Semitic prejudice to a greater or lesser extent, and the differences between the individual countries are not particularly great. Can we state, notwithstanding, that as far as the size of the anti-Semitic group is concerned, there is no essential difference between the populations of most European countries, but eventually the function and the dynamics of the phenomenon is basically different. And this is a very important question because we know from historical studies that the function of anti-Semitism in a given society is a more important factor from the point of view of the dynamics of anti-Semitism than the actual size of anti-Semitic groups. If we wish to study the function and dynamics of anti-Semitic prejudice, then first of all, we need to form an impression, a picture of whether or not anti-Semitism functions as a language, as a code system, or a culture in the given society, a culture, a language which used to interpret issues and conflicts which are otherwise unrelated to the place and the role of Jews in the society. The number of anti-Semites in any given society need not to be particularly great for diffuse prejudice to be transformed by circumstances into a dynamic political ideology. According to historians, like for example Shulamit Volkov from Tel Aviv University, this is what happened in Germany in the later third of the 19th century. The development and the dynamic growth of modern anti-Semitism in Imperial Germany, as has been explained by the historians, as a consequence of a combined effect of 4 preconditions. The first historical precondition was indisputably the presence of anti-Jewish prejudice. So anti-Semites are needed to create an anti-Semitic movement. But in order for anti-Jewish sentiment to grow dynamically, there also needed to be intellectuals willing and able to establish a cognitive link between the anti-Jewish prejudice and major societal problems. This is the second precondition. The third precondition is that an anti-Semitic ideology established in this manner could become a worldview accepted by a large section of society only because the society includes a relatively large group of people for whom anti-Semitism can provide an opportunity for social integration. And the fourth precondition is that it must be the political will present in the society in order to mobilize this anti-Semitic prejudice. Consequently, the question is whether this development, this historical development has any analogies in present-day Hungary. Can we refine the same 4 factors in the present-day Hungarian society? Should we fear that anti-Semitism will become a dominant factor in Hungarian politics owing to the combined effect of the various consequences of the Hungarian democratic transition? The first factor, as I try to demonstrate here, prejudice, the presence of anti-Semitic prejudice is proved by sociological surveys, though the tenacity and the size of the anti-Semitic group is not very much different from the same numbers in other European countries. But is there a risk, this is the second factor, is there a risk of anti-Semitism departing from the intellectual field and finding a social group for whom anti-Semitic ideology could perform a function similar to the one it played in Imperial Germany? Third factor. let's look at these two problems. Indeed, as we have heard in Raphael's presentation, after the fall of communism, it was a part of the intellectual discourse that the Jewish question first appeared. Jewish question in quotation mark. The main reason for this was that among intellectuals, Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals, the vocabulary and the language of the Jewish question remained intact through the post-war decades. The difference in the reaction of Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals related to the communist era was not that one of the groups, the Jewish or the non-Jewish, was well integrated and the other poorly integrated into the communist system, or that one side gave more support and the other side less support for the system, but the motives for supporting, accepting, or rejecting the system were different among the two groups, in accordance with the different historical experience, memory, etc. During the decades of communist rule, there arose around these differences and around the elements of identity constructed out of these differences, lobbying networks in various intellectual professions. These networks explained and justified themselves by claiming that they were only exercising legitimate defense against the other. Thus, the cohesion was created by the need of self-defense against Jewish solidarity or self-defense against anti-Semitic exclusion. This identity was constructed by a discourse using the notions of the Jewish question, although in its public form it was undertaken in exceptional circumstances and only in a coded language. It was in this language, sustained in the intellectual milieu for the duration of the communist era, that the stereotypes and anti-Semitic and anti-Semitic discursive schemes were conserved until the period of political change in the late 80s, and then they surfaced amid the conflicts in the post-transition period. After the collapse of the communist system, this intellectual discourse very quickly emerged at the level of politics. What's more, according to certain observers, the Jewish question was present in the divergent options of the left wing and the right wing. Now I quote one of these observations, quotation, these two options contain, right and left, these two options contain, in disguised form, different plans for society. The one side accepts without reservation the Western model of an open society, while the other side supports third way, Sonderweg, ideas and concepts. Since, however, Jews have historically played an important part in the implementation of Western development in Hungary, the relationship towards Jews appears, after all, to be one of the main sources of current ideological division. End of quote. In my view, however, we probably have to look elsewhere to find an explanation for this impression. One explanation is that the various political groupings in post-communist Hungary were unable to offer voters radically alternative social visions, and therefore they used preeminently historical and ideological symbols to distinguish themselves from each other. Another factor is that the new political parties appearing on the scene after the fall of communism suffered from a grave lack of legitimacy. They could not fall back on established party history, they were new, nor could they count on the support of a well-defined and distinguishable social groups. They were compelled, therefore, to establish their identities in the symbolic domain. And this domain became the principal arena for constructing party identity. The preferred field for discourse, for establishing identity, was history. And the leading participants of these discourses were the professional exponents of all memory discourses, the intellectuals. These debates reflected the struggle among intellectuals for influence and power, as well as the cleavages of intellectual subcultures. As a consequence, the language of the Jewish question, which already in the previous decades had served to express beneath the surface self-identity of various intellectual camps, soon became the language of the historico-political identity discourses and rapidly became embedded into political context. But what does this code, the code which is expressed by the concept of the Jewish question today, express? What is encoded in the anti-Semitic language? It is not longer self-evident that today the code is a code of anti-modernity. If divisions between the political camps are also expressed in the relationship towards the so-called Jewish question, then this relationship clearly does not form a boundary between modernity and anti-modernity. One cannot say that those who rediscover the Jewish question in contemporary Hungarian society are those who also reject the theory of market rationality, modern urban life, mass consumption, the rule of law, parliamentary democracy, modern technology, the use of cyberspace, rock music, subcultural trends, and many other things which are products of the modern world, and who, moreover, consider themselves to be a part of another cultural, coherent culture in opposition to all this, to modernity. When analyzing the anti-Semitic discourses of post-communist period, we found that the mainstream anti-Semitic discourses were in fact direct and almost undisguised expression of status conflicts among intellectuals, presented as essential political alternatives. The us and the them dichotomy did not denote modernist or anti-modernist cultures, but definable intellectual groups as well as parties and political groupings that such intellectual groups wish to form in their own image or which they consider to be their opponents. It seems, therefore, that in Hungary, after the fall of communism, the Jewish question has functioned as a code of political identity rather than as a cultural code of anti-modernity. And so it may be referred to as postmodern anti-Semitism in contrast to modern anti-Semitism in the 19th century. But does this code have any significance beyond the relatively narrow circle of intellectuals that actively use or merely understand the language of the Jewish question? This is the most important question when evaluating the dynamics of anti-Semitism. It was to observe that the groups instrumentalizing the Jewish question used the rhetoric, as Raphael demonstrated it, used the rhetoric of national self-defense for this aim. In this old context, the old anti-Semitic structures were transformed for simplification and rationalization of new political conflicts. The tensions caused by economic and cultural globalization were portrayed as a conflict between cosmopolitan and national interest. The consequences joining the process of international integration as the loss of national sovereignty, and the social consequences of economic and political transition as the results of being at the mercy of a colonial master. Meanwhile, either covertly, in coded form, or overtly, the image of the Jew as destroyer of the nation has evolved as the domestic agent of a colonizing foreigner. Thus, the old cliché of Jewish conspiracy was renewed. And what is more important, by this, a new cognitive association was construed between the Jewish question and new and acute political conflicts. And this is the second factor, as I mentioned, which is needed to form anti-Semitic prejudice into a dynamic ideology. What about the third factor? Does there exist in Hungary's post-communist society a social group which could be persuaded that the cause of the bad feelings or the feelings of vulnerability is that the whole nation is threatened? That the reason of the feeling of losing orientation is the destruction of national traditions, and the explanation for the deprivation is the irrepressible advance of the merciless stranger. If such a group exists in Hungary, then the third factor is present as well in the Hungarian society. If there is a group which experiences the emergence of the new institutions, norms, and regulations as a loss of status, a threat, a loss of orientation, a hopeless erosion of normality, and at the same time is capable of developing of forms of collective behavior that could cause perceptible damage to the social integration, then this could be a dangerous situation. I don't have time to go into details now, into sociological details. Now, what I would like to mention here in connection with the question is that electoral research in Hungary identified with an electoral group in the Hungarian electoral system, 20% of the total electorate, a group which displays either total refusal of participating in democratic processes or displays extreme volatility in its choices. So the group is wandering among between the extremes of the political scale. And the sociological characteristic of these groups is very similar to the sociological characteristic of the identified group of anti-Semites. This is a group which displays on one hand typically an electoral behavior which could be called typically a protest behavior, and on the other hand displays certain amount of prejudice which are stemming from an anomic feeling of being disintegrated in the society. So, if we add up all this, anti-Semitic prejudice seems to be present in the Hungarian society. Anti-Semitic language which connects old anti-Semitic cliches with newly emerged conflicts seem to be present as well. And there is a group in the Hungarian society which relates in an anomic way to the totality of the society, in an anomic way to the existing newly developed political democratic system. Does it mean that there is a danger in the Hungarian society that anti-Semitic politics could suddenly gain ground? And now we arrive to the fourth factor, the political will. The general circumstances, Hungary's integration into the European and Euro-Atlantic structures, its deepening involvement in European politics, the basic policy position of the country's mainstream political groupings, and many other factors render such development unlikely. Nevertheless, the country's future course depends in large part upon the political actors. The presence of anti-Jewish prejudice in society may persuade certain political forces and cultural groupings to attempt to transform anti-Jewish prejudice into a general language, culture, and the ideology, that is, to make it into an ism. For anti-Semitic political forces to acquire significant influence, there has always been a need for some members of the social elite to actively expose an anti-Semitic interpretation of events as a framework of explaining perceived social and political conflicts. But if the norm-setting political and culture, the norm-setting groups of political and cultural elites classify the anti-Semitic language and the anti-Semitic interpretation of the newly emerging conflicts as illegitimate, then there is a chance that the socio-cultural meaning of the anti-Semitic language will gradually fade away, and that anti-Jewish prejudice will be swallowed up by the expanding grey mass of ethnocentric and xenophobic prejudices. If this fails to happen, then bad times will come.
Thank you, Professor Kovacs. I think you can dedicate a few minutes for discussion. Professor Albin Rosenfeld.
Thanks to all three speakers for very rich and well-informed presentations. Yehuda, as always, yours was wide-ranging and hard-hitting and right on the money. Just one small consideration I'd like to put before you, however, to consider. You talked about the academic engagement with the Holocaust coming in the 70s, more or less, which is true, and the emphasis being on perpetrator history, which is also true, and a large part of education has followed those trends. However, on the popular level, we can take it back to the 1950s with an emphasis actually on victims. I think of the Diary of Anne Frank, 1952, the stage version, the film versions, 1955, Elie Wiesel's Night, 1960, Percy's The Wall and the Ghetto in the 50s as well, Primo Levi's books at a much higher level, all of these in fact reaching many millions of people. For all of Raoul Hilberg's magisterial contribution to our understanding of the Nazi terror, more people have seen Schindler's List and glimpsed the view of Nazi terror from that film than will ever read Raoul Hilberg's book. That's a pity, of course. And much of what I'm putting before you to consider in terms of popular culture is a mixed affair, to be sure. But there are layers of education, and the academic layer of education is only one. The popular level of education precedes it and shifts the emphasis from the perpetrator to the victim. And I wonder if that might just be a factor as you rethink mass education in the period ahead. Thank you.
Professor Raphael.
For the latest lecture about Hungary, you presented in your chart 4 major criteria for measuring anti-Semitism, from caring about one's kind to loyalty to the State of Israel. Now, how do you measure anti-Semitism? Do you need a cumulative effect of all 4, or one of them is sufficient? Because there are huge differences, perhaps by a factor or 2 or 3, within the same country, between one criterion and the other, and which makes a tremendous difference upon the measurement of anti-Semitism in any particular country. Thank you.
Professor Gilman.
I want to thank again all 3 panelists. I thought the papers were excellent. Yehuda, I'm going to pick on you. You make not the first time. Not the first time. You make an assumption, which I think not only is fallacious but is dangerous, which is that the motivation for the creation of Holocaust education is beneficent, and therefore the effect in general of Holocaust education is beneficent. I would make an argument that virtually every undertaking from 1945 to 2006 that has to do with Holocaust education was self-serving and instrumentalized. Its effect is very different, okay? I mean, how it impacts on the world is very different. And let me just take one example, because it was your example. Why was it that the Swedes decided to create this national and then international undertaking? Now, it is true that the moment of ignition was the reading incorrect, bad old about youth attitudes. The background, of course, was, as you know better than I, the exposure in Switzerland of Swiss culpability concerning the banking system, and the incredible anxiety in Sweden that the Swedes were next. Right? That the Swedes, in point of fact, had traded with the Nazis, that the Swedes, in point of fact, had been culpable to a degree much greater than the Swiss ever were in terms of perpetuating the Nazi military machine, supplying iron ore and so forth and so on. Now, I know you take the Prime Minister's kroner, so that you have to obviously think of this as coming out of a good, positive, liberal motivation. I think the effect has been spectacular. I think the Swedes have set a pattern, and the international organization that comes out of this has been exemplary. But the motivation was, in point of fact, completely self-serving. Now, I think that's important to say, because certainly in Holocaust studies, there is an assumption that the good guys have good motivation. And the answer in every case that I can think about, and we've heard Alvin totted up a bunch of them in terms of popular culture, one can ask very complicated questions about why Anne Frank becomes popular. That its effect is interesting, I think, is important. But I think one really does want to make that distinction.
Thank you, Professor.
One, is this on? Is this mic on? Okay. One comment to Andras Kovacs, and then two very brief points for Yehuda Bauer. A point that I did not have time to discuss yesterday was one finding of the Bederheim-Yalovitz study, which said that there were many factors behind the anti-Semitic sentiments that they discovered amongst those returning veterans, but the primary one was a perceived lack of social dynamism. That is to say, the perception that one's social position was not changing. And that was more important than the actual social position of the respondents. It sounds quite similar to what you're saying, so I wondered if Hungary, after 2000, is the United States in the early 1950s. Just a kind of pointed way of putting that. Yehuda Bauer, two questions. I take your point and I endorse your point that Holocaust education in the United States is centered around the idea of the Holocaust as a symbol for evil, and that this is also one of the worldwide issues. And the moral thrust of Holocaust education is certainly obvious to anyone who is familiar with it. I worry a bit about the impact that this has on the teaching of other aspects, for example, of German history and literature. And I'm sure you've heard about these worries from other people. If you just look at the numbers of courses offered, and in particular at the enrollments of those courses, it seems clear that the worry is justified that German history in particular before 1800 no longer exists. Not research, but his teaching of German history before 1800, and that the teaching of German history after 1800 is so highly centered on the Nazi period and the Holocaust that it's lost all sense of perspective. That's just a worry that I have, and I wonder how you would respond to that. The second point is about the word, this word, Holocaust. Bruno Bettelheim, in those awful debates of the 60s and 70s, made one point that I think is quite worthy of discussion even today. He called the term, the word Holocaust, an abomination before the Lord. What did he mean by that? He meant that Jews, by accepting it, have accepted a Christianization of the topic, the drawing from Greek mythology, the idea of the burnt offering, a kind of perversion, if you will, of the Old Testament view of these things, an attempt to give perverse meaning to one of the most meaningless events in human history. How do you see that?
And the last question, and Stephanie, last Amelia.
I can't reach, okay. I thought that in a Jewish surrounding I would be able to, but...
Take it down.
But I can tell you that usually when I want to reach the microphone, I have to jump.
Take it down.
There was one thing specifically in Mr. Bauer's speech that worries me, and may worry me in most speeches, though. The problem with anti-Semitism is not only education, because it may basically be that, but for instance in Holland, the anti-Semitism is mainly in the very low-level educated regions in the schools. Kids who can't even spell the word history, let alone have history. They don't have a clue about what's happening today, so they won't have a clue what happened yesterday. They are not interested in history. In Holland you have this curriculum where you can choose. I can tell you that most kids don't choose. Sorry?
If you can put the question.
Yes,
That's
and they won't choose history as a subject. So you have to force the information on them which they hardly can grab. So how would you address such a problem? We're trying though, but I'm interested in your answer.
Okay, I'll make it, you can hear from here. My question is also to Professor Bauer. You spoke about an increase basically in Holocaust education, but I wonder if it's possible to relate it also to our other topic of multiculturalism, whether the idea of Holocaust education nowadays being somehow more popular at a time where Israel as a focus for Jews and who are they is declining, and you are more interested in the culture of other groups within a particular country, and whether that there may be some relation to the growing Holocaust education and the growing focus on multiculturalism.
Let me start with the points I agree with, because that's always easier. Those are the last points. In other words, yes, I think you're absolutely right. It sort of fits into this multicultural thing, which makes it, on the one hand, easier, and on the other hand, of course, much more complicated. The ITF has been in existence since 1998, and only in the last 4 or 5 years have we really developed a kind of a set of curricula in different ways. And the experts, I'm not an expert on didactics and pedagogy, but we do have experts like that, and they are trying to deal with what you call low culture or more basic groups of society. We don't deal with the Holocaust there directly. We deal with discrimination with others and so on and so forth. And then we mention this as part of the thing. It's much easier, you can accept it much easier that way. Whether this is effective or not, I cannot really tell you. It's too early to say. Now, I couldn't agree more with Michael Ash on his 2 points. I use the term Holocaust here. Normally I use the term Shoah because it means catastrophe, and Holocaust actually is a word that was used in the 15th century in Germany, spelled with a K, Holocaust, for issues that were in a way connected, catastrophes caused by humans. Eberhard Jekyll turned my attention to this. That this is actually a German-used Greek concept. It's the wrong way to describe the genocide of the Jews, and I use the term genocide of the Jews often in my paper because I don't love the term Holocaust, but to spend your energy to discuss semantics is a waste of time. So let them use it. The other thing is your point about German literature. Again, it's absolutely correct. It's not only that. Inside the Jewish sphere, the Holocaust very often comes instead of Jewish civilization, Jewish culture, Jewish history. And what we try to emphasize is that the Holocaust is a very important part of Jewish history. It's not Jewish history, it's not Jewish identity, it's not Jewish civilization, something which is added from outside to it. The Jews were not the originators of the Holocaust, needless to say. They were the victims of it. Holocaust was a crime, an international crime, if you will. It has these 2 elements, the specificity of the Jews and the universal impact of that specificity. Now, much more difficult are the 2 first comments. What are Swedes self-serving? Well, who isn't? Come on now. What we do, isn't that self-serving? Everything is self-serving. That's why we do it. But the Swiss, I don't know whether you are aware of it, but the Swedes established a historical commission on Swedish responsibility, the so-called neutrality of Sweden, which turned out to be pro-German and so on and so forth, a year before the Swiss did. And when Persson made his intervention, he was working on the basis of what the Historical Commission had already found. So yes, it was self-serving. It's a very good thing that it was self-serving. Coming to Alvin's point, that's much more complicated. Because, you know, I mean, who am I telling this to? I mean, you wrote the best thing about the Anne Frank diary that I've ever read. But I don't have to tell you that the Anne Frank diary is not about the Holocaust. She had very, not her fault, she had very little idea what was happening outside. She had some information. And it was used in literature and in theater and in film and so on. And our friend Levine was fighting against that, not very successfully. As a universalizing thing, the introduction that Mrs. Roosevelt wrote to the Anne Frank diary didn't mention Jews, didn't mention the Holocaust, it mentioned the fate of a poor girl. It's not Holocaust literature. It was interpreted as such later on. And the rest is memoirs. And these were understood as the memoirs of victims, of objects of somebody else's rage. This is a complete distortion of the Holocaust facts. The Jews were not objects only. The Jews were subjects. They had a civilization. They had a culture. They had something which they reacted to, and they reacted. It didn't help them, but they reacted. And the universal implication of that is, how do people who are faced with genocide react? This is not Jewishly specific. This is universal. How do the Darfurians today react to the genocide against them? How did the Tutsi react in Rwanda? How did the Khmer, who were persecuted by other Khmer in Cambodia, react? How did the Cham in Cambodia react? How did the American Indians react? What was the reaction in 1829 to the deportation or exile of the Five Nations by Jackson in southeastern United States? Now you see, that's my professional distortion. You know, I'm a historian. I look at it from a hopefully wider perspective. And that's why I combine the specific Jewish tragedy with the universal one. And I object to denying the specificity of the Jews, just as I object to concentrating everything around a specific case. It's not the only specific case, but it's a very specific case. And to find, it's called dialectics. If you don't like Marx, go back to Hegel. If you don't like Hegel, go back to the Greeks. It's all the same thing. We are undialectically, instinctually undialectic creatures living in a dialectic world. We have to learn the dialectics. It doesn't come naturally. And that's the task, amongst other things, of Holocaust education. Now, you're absolutely right. There have been other things apart from academia. They are very important. But the interesting thing is that the really popularizing effects were done after the academic conferences. Do you know who Green came to when he did this, the transcript of this three-part film, Holocaust? He came to Lenny Yachil and to myself. You know, I'm an ancient. I was there. He asked, he didn't listen to us, but he consulted us. That's a good way of doing these things. Spielberg was clever enough not to consult with anyone. So he did it all on his own, made a lot of mistakes, and had a tremendous effect. Now, what the people want to achieve and what they achieve, as we all know, is very often something quite different. I don't know where Holocaust education is going to in matter of effect, how effective it will be. But look, it's better than not doing it. And what we are trying to do with all our tremendous efforts and attempts is to do something that will have an impact. In the end, anyone concerned with Holocaust education wants to prevent genocides from happening again. It probably won't succeed. You know, I don't believe in a good world. I am a radically left-wing, liberal, Israeli, Jewish atheist. I don't believe in a good world. But I believe in a slightly better world, perhaps.
Two questions. The first one was yours. I have showed you two charts, the Hungarian one and the international one. Well, the Hungarian one was created on the basis of complicated scales. I didn't want to get into details. The other one with the 4 questions. So the proportion of the anti-Semites, which made you 25%, was calculated on the basis of the yes, the agree answers, at least with 3 questions. The second one, which your question, yeah. So it is already well known after Janowitz and Bettelheim, but other research proved it too, that it is not downwards mobility which creates anti-Semitic prejudice, but the fear of loss of status. So, for example, in Austria, coming to your permanent, yes, I don't know. So, in Austria, the Christian Socialist Party under Lueger received support not from those parts of the Austrian society which perceived downwards mobility, because they went to the Social Democrats. The supporters of the Christian Socialists were those who were who did have a fear, who feared of loss of status. And this is exactly the case of the American veterans and partly the Hungarian society. This anomic group, which appeared as protest voter on one hand, as a group of protest voters on one hand, and as a group of prejudiced people on the other hand, were composed of people, mainly, who displayed a strong anomic attitude towards the society in which they live in, which meant a distrust in political institutions. They didn't believe that the rule of law exists. They didn't trust the politicians. They consider that norms are not valid anymore. Only the stronger people will win. The stronger will win in any case. And they had a strong nostalgia for the transparent and peaceful past of the communism. And these 3 factors compose a general attitude which can be called anomy. And this anomic feeling is very characteristic for this group. So it's not direct downward mobility, but a fear again.
Thank you to all participants. We take a break and we'll continue.